Hello, good morning. My name is Rachel Leidy. I am the owner of CyberSage Solutions. I am also a certified CMMC assessor and professional. I'd like to welcome you to my mini video series where I am communicating or sharing common issues that I've seen frequently enough during my assessments of NIST SP 800-171 implementation and the associated lessons learned in hopes that this information will be valuable to you or your organization when implementing these cyber requirements and preparing for an assessment. This is video 2 of 5. If you're interested in watching yesterday's video on scoping issues or the next 3 videos that I will be posting this week, follow me on LinkedIn as this is where I'm going to be posting video updates. The topic today is inheritance. So we're going to talk about what is inheritance, go over the definition of inheritance. So we are all going into the issues and lessons learned with the same understanding. And then I will briefly go over inheritance terms that you may run into when identifying inheritance or shared responsibility within your environment. And then next, we're going to talk about the issues I'm seeing related to inheritance and the associated lessons learned. We're going to talk about misapplied inheritance, incomplete review of inheritance documentation, lack of external service provider oversight and understanding, monitoring external service provider authorization status, and lastly, guidance awareness. So I've provided the definition of control inheritance from the CNSSI 4009, the CMMC rule, and NIST SP 800-171 does not provide a definition for control inheritance or inheritance. But if you are in this world and you are aiming to implement these requirements, you will most likely hear the word inheritance frequently. So the definition is a situation in which a system or application receives protection from controls or a portion of the controls that are developed, implemented, assessed, authorized, and monitored by entities other than those responsible for the system or application, entities either internal or external to the organization where the system or application reside. Inheritance is commonly communicated via a customer responsibility matrix. This is often a spreadsheet or a Word document that lists out all of the security controls that you are aiming to implement in your environment and identifies whether the external service provider offering has implemented that control requirement for you and is that they are responsible for implementing and maintaining that security control requirement in the environment, or it will identify security controls where there is a shared responsibility for implementing that control within the environment, or it's going to identify the security controls that are solely your responsibility for implementing within the environment. That's going to be found in a customer responsibility matrix, a CRM. The benefits of inheritance is for an organization seeking assessment is that the implementation and maintenance time and cost associated with NIST SP 800-171 could potentially be reduced or greatly reduced, depending on how you are designing and deploying your environment, as well as your efforts within an assessment are going to be reduced. So the security controls that are being inherited by the external service provider for that system, application, or environment are not going to be your responsibility to fully evaluate or speak to the implementation of that requirement within the environment, because an assessor is going to review that customer responsibility matrix that identifies that delineation of external service provider responsibility and your responsibility as the OSA, and they are only going to assess the OSA's responsibility. The external service provider effort is little to none during a CMMC level 2, level 3 certification assessment. And this is only applicable if we're talking about external service providers that meet FedRAMP authorization or equivalency, or in the future, this is just my interpretation or what I expect to happen, as well as some of the guidance I've read alludes to this. But in the future, for external service providers that have gone through and passed a CMMC level 2 or 3 assessment, will not need to participate in a assessment for their clients or the OSA. So when talking about inheritance and the terms used within a customer responsibility matrix should only be used for environments that are FedRAMP authorized or equivalent, approved, and CMMC level 2 or 3 certified. Final certification. And this is because during those assessments, for when you're talking about full inheritance, like the definition says, is that those controls have been implemented, assessed, and authorized. So they've already been authorized. And so your FedRAMP authorization process is going to authorize those cloud service providers that need to meet that requirement. And then under CMMC, external service providers who have gone through certification, those environments have been authorized. And so if those environments, if you're utilizing those type of environments, those external service providers will not participate in your CMMC certification assessment. The assessor will review your body of evidence and the customer responsibility matrix and only evaluate, if there's no issues, only evaluate the controls or portion of the controls that are your responsibility as the OSA for implementing and maintaining within that environment. So that's important. I've seen individuals where they use the terms and terms inheritance, fully inherited, hybrid, system specific. Those are commonly used for when you're speaking about environments that have been assessed and authorized, and the control can be fully inherited and will not be evaluated for implementation during your assessment. So some terms that you may see. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So to continue on, related to inheritance. So for inheritance, FedRAMP authorized or equivalent external service providers or CMMC certified external service providers, they're going to provide you a customer responsibility matrix, a CRM. And again, those controls will not be evaluated during your assessment if there are no issues. Now, for external service providers that do not have, due to lack of need, a FedRAMP authorization or equivalency or a CMMC certification, they will need to participate in your CMMC assessment. You cannot inherit any controls that external service provider is implementing or maintaining on your behalf. And when you talk about controls and responsibility with regards to an external service provider who does not have authorization or certification, you're going to document that security control responsibility in a shared responsibility matrix, an SRM. It's important to note that during your assessment, again, any controls that are being implemented or the implementation is being maintained, or the responsibility for completing that control activity, any of those controls that are being performed by the external service provider, if that external service provider does not have a FedRAMP authorization or equivalency or CMMC certification, they are going to need to be available and assist with your CMMC certification assessment. All right, I think that's everything for that. Okay, so now into terms. And again, it's, sometimes people say inheritance when really they should say, shared responsibility. So here's some terms. In my mind, I like to keep them separate like this. However, there's no hard definition on when it's appropriate to use these terms or not. So, always understand your environment and who the provider is that is providing this documentation and what their responsibility is. For CRMs, customer responsibility matrix, this again is FedRAMP authorized or equivalent, CMMC certified. In a CRM, you're going to see terms like inherited or fully inherited. That is where the control and its implementation is being performed by that external service provider. And you do not have any responsibility with regards to implementing and or maintaining that control requirement. Hybrid is where there is shared responsibility. It's where your external service provider is responsible for implementing a portion of the security control requirement, and then you are also responsible for implementing a portion of that requirement. And then system specific is when you, as the OSA, are fully responsible for implementing the full security control requirement in the environment that is under the purview of this customer responsibility matrix. So in that environment or system or application. Shared responsibility matrix, SRM, you'll also see inherited. You can also see full ESP responsibility. And then shared or partial is when there is both parties have a responsibility to implement the requirement. And then customer responsibility is when you are responsible for implementing that control requirement. Again, an SRM, a CRM is only applicable to the environment that is provided by environment, system, or application that is provided by that external service provider. Which leads me into my first issue I've seen a good amount of times is misapplied inheritance. The issue I've seen is where a organization seeking assessment, a DIB contractor, is utilizing an external service provider, cloud service environment, or a software as a service tool that is hosted in the cloud, and they have been provided by that external service provider or that software provider a CRM, customer responsibility matrix, that lists out the NIST SP 800-171 controls and identifies what the cloud service provider is responsible for with regards to that offering and what you're responsible for. And then the issue is that the organization, the OSA, will take that CRM and apply it to their entire environment. Not just the offering from the external service provider, not just that external service provider's application system or environment that you're utilizing. This is a big issue, and it will lead to many security control failures during an assessment, and many compliance gaps, security related issues. It's just important to understand that CRM is only applicable to that system application environment offering that the external service provider in question is providing you under an agreement. It does not relate. They are not speaking to how those controls are implemented in your entire environment. They are not speaking to how the security controls are implemented in other systems, applications, and environments within your environment. So if you're thinking, it's typically a cloud service provider or an application, but you're going to have, most likely, depending on your environment, you're going to have on-prem assets that may or may not be in scope, the CMMC assessment, and those on-prem assets are not being managed or maintained by that cloud service provider. So the example that I've seen is where there's a software as a service application, it's hosted in the cloud, the data is stored in the cloud, and companies are failing to identify how the security control requirements are implemented on that user endpoint that is accessing or utilizing that software being provided, which leads to almost all of the technical controls in the NIST SP 800-171 failing due to lack of implementing and addressing that security control. Another example is, let's say, I've also seen where you have Microsoft cloud services, and you're utilizing Entra ID, and Entra ID is managing, maintaining, implementing, pushing policies to your user endpoints. But then you may have some non-domain joined assets, or maybe Linux servers or other assets within your environment, specifically SPA assets. You have a firewall on-prem, maybe you have some wireless access points, maybe you have a physical security badge system. Those assets are not being maintained by Entra ID. Entra ID is not pushing policies or security control settings to those assets, those other assets that are your responsibility. So misapplied inheritance, just make sure that CRM or SRM, if we're talking about external service providers that are not authorized or assessed, then make sure that you're only applying the control inheritance statements to the system, application, or environment under the agreement with that external service provider. All right, let's see. Ensure inheritance only applies to assets explicitly defined in the provided documentation. Validate the scope of inheritance during scoping and SSP creation. Your lesson here is always confirm the scope of inheritance documentation and apply accordingly. The next issue is incomplete review of inheritance documentation. This is for full inheritance where your external service provider is either FedRAMP authorized or equivalent or CMMC certified. So for those external service providers, the requirement that you will, during an assessment, what you will need to obtain from those providers is the body of evidence. There is a DoD memo that was provided back in December of 2023, I think, or January. Anyway, that lists out what is required to be in a body of evidence with regards to equivalency. FedRAMP authorization does provide a similar body of evidence. So it's making sure that during your assessment, prior to your assessment, that you are communicating with that external service provider and requesting the latest and greatest body of evidence. That is your responsibility as an OSA. If you do not have that body of evidence, and if you're unable to provide it during the assessment, that will lead to failures of the security controls that potentially could lead to many failures of the security controls that are advertising inheritance from that external service provider. So, importance of reviewing the body of evidence, including CRMs, thoroughly. It's important to review the evidence, the body of evidence, which will include a CRM, a customer responsibility matrix, thoroughly to understand how the security is being implemented in that environment and what your responsibility is for implementing and maintaining security in that environment. Identify control implementation details, what the provider handles versus what you, the OSA, is responsible for. And in general, I'm seeing a lack of implementing or addressing your OSA responsibilities. So I've seen where organizations are not reviewing the CRM provided to them thoroughly, or they've somehow missed some controls where they are responsible for performing some actions, and they are not implementing those as they should be. So reviewing that CRM and understanding where that delineation of responsibility is, and then ensuring you are doing what is required of you with regards to that offering. So that's the lesson learned number 2. Thoroughly review and understand your body of evidence provided by external service providers. The 4th lesson is monitoring external service provider authorization status. The issue here I've seen once during a JSVA, that was pretty unfortunate, and then another time during a client's NIST SP 800-171 validation assessment performed by DIBCAC, which we were able to avoid issues there. But I've seen where you go into an assessment, you're using an external service provider, and that external service provider has lost their authorization or their equivalency status. And therefore, during that assessment, every control that is advertising external service provider inheritance, either full inheritance or hybrid partial inheritance, is automatically evaluated as not met during the assessment, which can be many, many controls depending on what it is that external service provider is providing to you. So again, it's really important. Well, Again, during that assessment, the external service provider lost FedRAMP equivalency or authorization, and then for that assessment, we had to evaluate all of the controls that talked about external service provider inheritance as not met. Even if that control is being implemented, it was not met. So it's important to monitor and track FedRAMP authorization and equivalency, and in the future, external service provider CMMC certification status. It's important to just continuously track that, so you can ensure that your environment is maintaining its compliance. But also, when you're going into scheduling an assessment, you're going to want to try to aim to schedule those assessments during stable authorization periods. Typically, a FedRAMP authorization is good for 3 years, same as CMMC certification, good for 3 years. So you may not want to schedule your CMMC certification assessment during that end of the 3-year mark, when you know the external service provider is going to be submitting for and trying to obtain reauthorization or recertification. But there are, an external service provider can also lose equivalency or lose authorization or lose certification within those 3 years, potentially. So at all times, monitor that authorization status to ensure you're compliant. Also, when scheduling any sort of assessments that you're going to be going through, and then understand that if you go into a level 2, level 3 certification assessment and that external service provider has lost its authorization status, then it could impact your assessment results greatly. All right, and then the last lessons learned is same from yesterday. I'm going to include this slide on every... Oh, I'm sorry. It's not. I messed up. All right, this is the fourth one. I got my numbering messed up, but all right, this is the fourth. There's 5 issues here. This is the fourth. So lack of external service provider oversight and understanding. This is I'm talking about external service providers who do not have FedRAMP authorization, equivalency, or CMMC certification. This is for those external service providers that are going to provide you a shared responsibility matrix, or you're going to work with them to develop a shared responsibility matrix, and they are going to participate in your CMMC certification assessment. The issues I'm seeing is that there's a lack of communication between what the organization seeking assessment understands the external service provider to be doing for them and providing to them, and what the external service provider believes that they need to do and provide for you. So there's just a lack of alignment between the security requirements and what, how the security requirements are implemented, how they were designed to be implemented, and what activities need to be performed, and the frequency those activities need to be performed, and the output that is required for that security control, so that you, during your assessment, can provide evidence that that control is being performed as stated in your system security plan or policies, supporting policies, procedures, processes, which leads to a failure. So the external service provider deliverables must align with the organization seeking assessment's security requirements as documented in your system security plan. Again, if you watch my video from yesterday, your system security plan is going to define the method of security control implementation for your in-scope assets. An assessor is going to read that implementation narrative and then test to see if it is being implemented. If your external service provider is not aware of that implementation narrative, maybe it's been a year or so since you communicated it to them, maybe they've updated their processes and procedures, maybe you've updated the SSP and didn't send that updated narrative over to your external service provider, there's a lack of communication. So you're going to want to make sure, what they are doing for you aligns with what you say they are doing for you. And then further evaluate to ensure that that activity is meeting the requirements and is adequately implemented, which leads into lack of monitoring services performed. Understand that NIST SP 800-171 is the responsibility of the organization seeking assessment to implement and maintain. Even if you are using an external service provider, which is great, it alleviates the level of work, effort, and potentially cost that you would have to implement that you would have to cover if you were performing the security controls internally. But it is ultimately your responsibility. So you're going to want to continuously monitor that what you and that external service provider agreed upon is being conducted in a manner that aligns with that system security plan documentation. And during these situations, for these type of external service providers, again, they do not have FedRAMP authorization or equivalency, nor a CMMC certification. And so during your CMMC level 2, level 3 certification assessments, you are going to need to coordinate with that external service provider, making sure that they are going to be available during that assessment period and that they are providing you the necessary evidence for those controls that they have assumed responsibility for. Lessons learned is ensure oversight of external service provider deliverables and engage them during assessments. This is the last lessons learned. This is same as yesterday's last lessons learned, and just talking about guidance awareness and how I've gone into consulting arrangements or assessments, and the organization seeking assessment is not aware of the CMMC assessment scope document or the CMMC assessor's guide, level 2, level 3 assessor's guide, and other documentation out there. All of that is publicly available. And the URL that I provide on this slide is a one-stop shop to almost all of the documentation, references, supporting artifacts that you would need to help you with implementing these requirements in your environment and preparing for an assessment. So if you just Google DoD CIO's CMMC website, it's going to pop up a page and it has everything you could possibly need. Of course, YouTube, LinkedIn, there's a lot of great consultants, great assessors, great providers out there that are offering and providing free information. All right, so the lessons learned here is to proactively explore available resources and stay informed so that you can avoid common assessment challenges, ensuring a smoother compliance effort and assessment for your organization. All right, well, that's it for today's topic. I hope this was helpful, and I hope I clearly communicated the issues that I've seen and the lessons learned, and that you can apply these lessons learned to strengthen your NIST SP 800-171 implementation and go into a CMMC assessment without any major issues. The topic I will be posting tomorrow is specific to shared responsibility. And if you have any questions, concerns, or comments, or you need help, feel free to reach out to me at support@cybersagesolutions.io. All right, thank you. Have a good day.